So my last lecture, I was talking about ending it on the two different Latin Americas, and talking about how that affects people's politics, and also you might have people who come from more affluent backgrounds that also are disturbed by the fact of there being so much of the poverty taking place. So we're going to go into a few discussions of the U.S. role in this. So U.S. intervention in Guatemala in 1954 and overthrow of democracy, part one. We already kind of talked about this a little bit, but you had President Jacobo Arbenz from Guatemala. He's president 1951 to 1954. He had a national agrarian reform program where he's basically reducing a lot of big landowners and breaking up their lands into smaller portions. United Fruit Company, as a U.S. company, owned over 40% of the arable land. That's a lot. Now, this was during the time of the Eisenhower administration, and he already had a success, Eisenhower, in a CIA coup of overthrowing democracy in Iran in 1953. We'll talk about this more next week, and the influence that would end up having on the Islamic Revolution of Iran and the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini. But so the U.S. started seeing the ability of the CIA to help orchestrate overthrowing of governments that weren't considered to be a part of our interests. That is the U.S. interests. Often in the name of halting Soviet influence or communism. Or was it just to protect United Fruit Company? That's the kind of discussions or questions that people have. So there was a CIA military junta, basically a control taken by Colonel Carlos Castillo. And there was a public relations expert, Edward Bernays, who helped kind of make this overthrowing of democracy look like it's protecting the Western Hemisphere. Now, but for people in Latin America, of course, it was very clear. Frida Kahlo, the famous artist, now remember she was a communist. I discussed this a little bit in some of the earlier lectures. Her last public political action was in 1954, demonstrating against the CIA organized military coup in Guatemala. So people in Latin America have known that the U.S. has been involved in doing these things since then. I think it's fair to say the majority of Americans aren't aware of the U.S. role in doing these kind of things in Latin America. In any case, that is a historical legacy there. So now let's focus on Cuba. I have land of pro-U.S. dictator and U.S. interests. Well, is that fair? I think so. You had Batista here. His first presidency, he was quite different. He was leftist friendly and pro-ally. The interwar and the World War II years. He had a military coup in his second presidency, and he was pro-elite, and he was also favored by U.S. leadership. And by 1959, U.S. private interests owned a majority of the resources in Cuba, and you had quite a bit of wealthy Cubans who enjoyed the U.S. influence there and the rule by Batista. So you have like a minority of elites enjoying that. And then you had people who were opposed to him. Here's Fidel Castro before he put on all the army gear, right? Fidel Castro he came from a wealthy family. So ironically, actually, by the way, Batista, who I went back to, was a man who came from the poor and rose up to basically serve the rich. Fidel Castro came from a wealthy family and ends up becoming radical and kind of fights on behalf of the poor. So, life's full of ironies. He's involved in activism while attending University of Havana. He became a lawyer. So, I don't know if you know this, but Fidel Castro actually was a lawyer before he became a revolutionary, and some consider a benevolent or an evil dictator, depending on who you talk to, right? In 1947, he attempted to overthrow the U.S.-backed dictator Trujillo of the Dominican Republic with 1,200 men, and it failed to materialize. So Trujillo in Dominican Republic is a whole other topic. If you look him up, he really was a terrible, terrible character. But Fidel had an interest in overthrowing these kind of pro-Western dictators. It didn't always work for him, but it's interesting that eventually it would. And it's kind of a wild, I mean, it's hard for me to conceptualize myself, a person who's wealthy, becomes a lawyer, and spends much of his time doing things like trying to overthrow dictators and somehow getting away with it. I mean, we're not talking about an armchair revolutionary, someone who's actually attempting to do these things. So, in that case, he escaped getting in trouble over that failed event. He goes to Colombia. There was the Argentinian President Juan Peron, who's also in your book reading, a sponsor sued us to go to Bogota, Colombia, and he witnessed massive riots against the government there. Around 3,000 people died. He participated, and he somehow, gets through that. Batista leads a coup in 1952. Fidel has a failed revolt against him in 1953 at an army garrison in Santiago, Cuba. He's imprisoned, and he gives this speech, which he then expands into a pamphlet called History Will Absolve Me. And that's always an interesting question that we have now, right? As a history class and as historians, he has quite a controversial legacy. Will history absolve him? We'll find out. Right now, it's probably too early to tell. But it was distributed all over Cuba, and it made him pretty popular. He was released from prison 2 years later due to growing public campaign. And remember, he had come from a wealthy family. I think this probably also helped. He probably had, I believe he did have some like kind of connections there to maybe take it easy on him. But so he goes to Mexico, and he begins to organize a guerrilla movement. And he meets an Argentinian guy named, which is the nickname Che, because Argentinians have a little, like, after they say things like, ¿Cómo está, Che? Like, they say Che, like a little word whisker. Like some people say, hey, what's up, way? Some people think that that's bad language in Spanish. But anyways, so he's a doctor. And these guys get together to train, and they're setting themselves up to overthrow the government in Cuba. Okay? And they get a cruiser called the Grandma. What's going to happen? I'm going to stop here. We're going to move on to the next lecture. And we'll find out.